Left, Right, in the Middle is made possible through grant funding by SRCI, the Student Research and Creativity Institute at Saginaw Valley State University. SRCI, your dream, your project, your research.
Pick me a town in any clime where people like a rockin' time. Stay awake both day and night till everybody's feeling good and right. Then throw me a smack dab in the middle. Pitch me a smack dab in the middle. Throw me hay.
Breaking news now for you on the West Coast. You are seeing here a map of Connecticut. Connecticut State Police and SWAT teams are now responding to a school shooting at an elementary school in Newtown. It's roughly 2 hours to the north and east of New York City. The images you see here, children being led from Sandy Hook Elementary School.
We've endured too many of these tragedies in the past few years. Whether it's an elementary school in Newton or a shopping mall in Oregon or a temple in Wisconsin or a movie theater in Aurora or a street corner in Chicago, these neighborhoods are our neighborhoods and these children are our children. And we're going to have to come together and take meaningful action to prevent more tragedies like this, regardless of the politics.
Welcome to Left, Right, in the Middle. I'm your host, Scott. The opening audio was an ABC News report breaking the news of the Sandy Hook shootings and some of President Obama's comments following. The music was a Seneca Indian funeral chant. And as I noted in my last show, I was planning on doing this show on the Fiscal Cliff. However, following the Sandy Hook school shooting that took place on the 13th, I switched gears and decided to do a show on gun control. Upon creating this podcast, gun control was a topic that I knew I would eventually cover. And I think that given the recent events, not just at Sandy Hook, but over the last few years, now is a good time to tackle that topic. Concerning the fiscal cliff, in a nutshell, it's a joke. It's a way for both sides to claim that they can't get anything done concerning the budget or sensible tax code because the other side won't work with them or present options that they can work with. It's basically a way that both parties can say to their base, see, the opposition is entrenched in their beliefs and unreasonable, and that's why we can't move forward. In the end, we'll likely go over the cliff, yet find that it was just a bump and nothing will change. We'll still have massive budget deficits, a lack of sensible progressive taxation, and continued threats to cut programs that help the poor and elderly so that the 1% can keep gobbling up 90% of the wealth. And remember this, a synonym for cliff is bluff. One key thing I've noticed throughout these past weeks is that there hasn't been rational discussion about cutting the one area that truly needs to be drastically slashed, our military and defense budget. Without really going over the numbers, but having a general idea of them, I think that if we cut military spending by about a quarter and raised the taxes on those making $250,000 and up back to the Clinton-era tax rates, I think that would be about a 3 to 5% increase, so not too drastic, we would likely have a surplus. So if there's any economists out there listening, do the math and get back to me on that. Anyway, back to today's topic, gun control. Being a confessed liberal leftist and a pacifist, my thoughts on gun control might surprise you. I have no problems with ownership of assault rifles and the like. Hell, I'd say that you can own a tank if you're qualified to use it and it's properly registered, and I think this is a truly liberal view. Meaning, allowing for individual freedoms or ownerships of items is liberal. Trying to restrict ownership or availability is conservative, at least in my view. Anyway, I think the discussion we should have is what kind of regulations we should actually have, what's reasonable and what's restrictive. And I say what's restrictive in the sense of just so we can feel safe, and I put safe in air quotes. We tend to have knee-jerk reactions in this country following tragic events that happen, and these reactions immediately condone restricting everyone's freedoms due to the actions of a few. So for this show, I'd like to explore what some of the reaction has been following Sandy Hook, current policy concerning gun control, what could be adopted as reasonable policy, and even a little bit about where our mental health system fits into all this. So I hope you'll stay tuned to this episode of Left, Right in the Middle and join the conversation on Facebook.
There's nothing left of this day. There's nothing left of this town. Our time has ceased with such sorrow. There's no one left here to mourn. There's nothing left of this day.
I think to start out this conversation, we first need to examine the Second Amendment and what it might possibly mean. It states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The key contention of this amendment has been whether the founders meant that states should have the right to maintain stocks of weapons for the formation of militias, or whether this pertains to an individual's rights. Now, the growing consensus of legal scholars, as well as 2008 Supreme Court ruling, District of Columbia et al. Versus Heller, contends that the Second Amendment upholds an individual's rights to possess arms. So the individual has the right to bear arms as upheld by the Supreme Court, but that doesn't speak to what authority the Congress, meaning the federal government, has to regulate said possession. I think here we have to look at the infamous necessary and proper clause. Under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Congress has the power, and this is a quote, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof, end quote. Now, necessary and proper is such a broad term that it basically gives Congress carte blanche to enact any law in relation to commerce or public safety. So here's where we stand. The individual has the right to possess firearms, but the federal government also has the right to regulate said ownership. But what does this mean? Amount of weapons, caliber of weapons, type of ammunition, etc. I think a huge problem here is that when the founders wrote the Second Amendment, militias were using muskets and cannons. The founders couldn't see the future. Now we have automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. What rights do we give people, and what do individual citizens really need concerning weapons? Is it enough to give people the right to own a gun for protection or to hunt? If you consider that the security of a free state requires a well-armed militia, then I would think automatic weapons and possibly more would be required. But let's not focus on militias, we'll just focus on individuals for this discussion. Does an individual need an automatic weapon? I would say no. Now remember, I believe an individual should have the right to possess any size or caliber weapon, provided that they are qualified to use it and it is registered. But what I'm posing is basically a need versus a want. Some people may want to own an automatic weapon, but do they need to? Again, I say no. So I have no problem with reasonable regulations that allow individuals to own handguns and rifles for personal protection and hunting, or if they just like to go shoot up tin cans in the field behind their house. Different strokes for different folks, right? But this is provided that they are qualified to use them and every weapon is registered. Now, what do I mean by reasonable regulation? Well, you need to take classes to operate a car. I think the same should go for operating any firearm. And much like there are different classes of driver's licenses, There could be different classes of gun operators' licenses. Possibly a license for handgun, a license for rifle. Different calibers could fall under different classifications, etc. You need to go to classes over a designated period of time, pass a test on operating that weapon in that license classification, and then pass a shooting range inspection, much like you have to pass a driver's test. Moreover, I think that every gun should be registered and insured like a vehicle for liability reasons. This would not only cover liability for gun owners and provide compensation for victims of gun violence, it would also help keep track of weapons. Someone's not going to keep paying insurance on a weapon they don't own. You could track weapons through that. If somebody changes over ownership, they're going to change over registration, they're going to change over insurance, and all of that is on file, and it's something that the government can track. Now, I also think that there should be a yearly registration fee for each gun, just like a car. Again, this would help ensure that guns are tracked, and it would also raise revenues. And each state could determine their individual fee and stipulations. And this is basically how I felt about gun control pre-Sandy Hook, and even pre-Columbine. Now remember, I'm a pacifist. I've never owned a gun, and I never plan to own a gun. But I believe in the right to responsible and regulated ownership for those who choose to. Now, are the regulations that I stated reasonable? Now, I'd love your thoughts on that. Go to the Facebook page and let me know. But as I said earlier, we tend to have a knee-jerk reaction in this country when tragedies such as Sandy Hook happen. And in the age of social media and 24/7 infotainment channels, that jerk seems to be larger than ever. Now, I don't want to seem callous or belittle the tragedy or deaths that occurred on 12/13. But folks, it seems that we only react to what the media tells us we should react to. I believe the death toll in Sandy Hook was 28, 20 of them children around 5 to 7 years old, and that's horrific. I have a 5-year-old son myself, and of course, I immediately thought of him when the news broke. However, Sandy Hook is a local tragedy, portrayed as a national event and amplified as such by the media. And I think that the fact that young children were the main victims here helped amplify it. Face it, we live in a society that craves violence in movies, novels, video games, comics, music. Whatever media choice we have, we love violence in it. Yet, when that violence becomes real, we act as if it's a stranger that just sat down for dinner. Now understand, I'm not saying that violence in these entertainment outlets is the reason for that violence that day. I'm saying that we seem to use violent portrayals as a way to escape without accepting that this could become a reality. Anyway, back to the point I was trying to make. At Sandy Hook, there were 28 deaths. Again, horrific. Now, everyone wants to jump on the weapons ban bandwagon. You now see a lot of politicians and pundits who previously stood for gun owners' rights now saying it's time to rethink that stance. Why? Because there was a terrible violent act? Didn't you understand that was always a possibility? Are you that ignorant? No, of course you aren't. You're just that fickle. The growing sentiment of voters, fueled by the media coverage, dictates that you should change your stance. And here I finally get to my main point. 28 dead at Sandy Hook, mostly children. And now we can finally consider a gun control discussion. Now, what if the media had cared that much about the death of children in Iraq? A war that was started because of misinformation and lies. So therefore, and this is just my opinion, every civilian death should be considered a murder sanctioned by Uncle Sam himself. So what if the media cared? What if the media gave a constant blitz of information concerning not only the civilian deaths, but specifically the deaths of innocent Iraqi children? Could we have ended this war sooner? I'd say possibly so. I tried to find out how many children had been killed in Iraq since we started that war of mass deception, and there are no hard figures, but this is what I figure. Several estimates from different organizations put the civilian death toll from 2003 to 2008 at roughly 40,000 to several hundred thousand, and one had it near 400,000. Actually, over 400,000. So I'm going to round that out at 100,000, although I suspect it's more. And remember, these numbers are from 2003 to 2008. We haven't stopped killing civilians there since then. Now, the CIA fact book states that 38% of the Iraqi population is 0 to 14 years old, otherwise classified as children. So let's just assume that just 25% of the civilian casualties have been children, even though 38% of the population is of that age. That means 25,000 children have died due to our illegal actions in a sovereign nation. And of course, that's likely a conservative number. So where's the cry for justice here? The cry for a ban on war? The cry for action? There is none, because the media isn't telling you to care. See my point? 20 children die in America, and the reaction is to explore taking away rights of citizens. 25,000 children die due to our actions in a sovereign nation, and there's barely a whisper. Okay, so maybe you're saying, I don't care about deaths in a foreign country. The last decade has told me that most Americans don't. But what about right here in America? It is estimated that 72 people die daily in America due to lack of sufficient health care, or about 3 an hour. That's basically 3 Sandy Hooks daily happening due to lack of sufficient health care coverage in this country. So why don't the media tell you to care about that? My assumption is that it isn't horrific or sensational enough. Someone dying from lack of treatment for cancer or diabetes isn't really newsworthy. Now, someone getting their brains blown out by a rampaging gunman, give us more of that. Our founders set up our government so that the whims of the people don't dictate policy. And they were smart in doing so. I'm just saying, really think about how much we want to restrict people's freedoms. I think we need a discussion about what types of weapons should be allowed and what types of regulations there should be. But we needed that discussion well before Sandy Hook. Let's not have another Patriot Act reaction that creates policies completely antithetical to the purpose of the founding of this nation. Let's react sensibly and not have buyer's remorse. Let's not allow Patriot Act 2.0.
Never mentioned this before. It seems I'm always last to know. So I have to guess they're gonna feel each day. Never have a word to say. You should have told me. I don't understand why you didn't tell me. Surely you must know I hate what I'm doing. I don't want to upset you, risk yourself, you're fooling. Last thing I need is parts well on the route. But just why are you being so reasonable now?
I've included some links at the website that provide information concerning the history of gun control in America, so I'm not going to get bogged down in trying to detail that. So check out the website if you want and explore that for yourself. Now I know that some of what I propose concerning licensing already exists to some extent. I'm proposing that this be expanded. Let's treat firearms like vehicles, in the sense of requiring that users go through an extensive certification process to purchase firearms in various classifications, and once firearms are purchased, a yearly registration fee and insurance of those firearms is required. And I don't think that's too much to ask, considering that's what we do with vehicles in this country. We should be able to track them and have somebody pay a fee to own them each year. Like I said, that adds to revenue, and it helps us be able to track those particular weapons. Now, I know that some will say that this is too restrictive or that it just adds to big government, to which I say that that's just the nature of the beast. If we are to have an open and civil society, we need to have some sort of watchdog, and the natural watchdog is government. I don't know that you can have both an open and civil society without government regulations in many areas. And something that is made to kill an animal or a person should most certainly be highly regulated. Again, we need to ensure that those regulations aren't too restrictive as to trample the basic right of firearm ownership as decreed by the Second Amendment. However, we do need comprehensive federal regulations that set a standard that individual states can work within to tweak to their liking. And then the states can decide things, like what the fees are going to be, or whether or not people can carry a concealed weapon or not, or things like the stand your ground laws. But there should be a basic framework set up by the federal government, and then the states can act within that. Now, since Sandy Hook, it seems that the two sides in the gun control debate have gone to extremes. Emotions are running high, which makes any chance at civil and productive discourse concerning the issue nearly impossible. In social media circles, I've seen many on the left calling for extreme weapons bans, and many on the right saying we need to arm teachers, get more guns out there because the only way you can stop somebody with a gun is with a gun yourself. Or even more extreme, there's been a proposal to train our children to run towards the shooter to try to overwhelm them. All of these responses are part of the knee-jerk that I was referring to earlier. Instead of having productive discussions concerning the issue prior to an incident, such as Sandy Hook, we wait until a tragedy like that occurs, and then we use it to exploit our agenda or ideology. Moreover, the media uses such tragedies and ensuing ideological positioning for ratings. It's basically a win-win for everyone but those directly affected by the incident. As much as we say that we care or feel for the victims, their families, and their communities, we don't. We only care about advancing our agenda. This is true of the left and the right. And of course, here I am, less than 2 weeks removed from the tragedy, talking about gun control myself, so in a way I'm just as guilty. I just hope that I'm offering some perspective that is otherwise overlooked. I hope that it's clear that I'm not trying to advance an agenda. I'm trying to promote rational thought concerning an issue that should have been addressed a long time ago. So what have been some of the extreme or ideological responses? Well, being a liberal, I have a lot of liberal friends. I have some that are conservative, but it's likely about a 4-to-1 ratio, if not higher. And much of what I've seen or heard from my liberal brethren is called for outright elimination of firearms in America. And that's not going to happen, nor should it. If you don't want to own a firearm, don't. But don't ask that someone else give up that right. Now, what you can ask for is sensible regulation concerning firearm ownership, as well as the types of firearms that can be made available. Conversely, from those on the right, I've seen calls for looser restrictions so that more people can possess firearms to protect themselves, which to me sounds like they would like a return to the Wild West and high noon shootouts. There have also been calls for arming teachers. Ironically, these calls come from the same people that often claim teachers are overpaid. So would they get a bump in pay if they were required to carry a firearm? Would they then be worthy of their pay? And how would this work? Do they carry it on them at all times so that there's the possibility of a student grabbing it off their person? Do they lock it up, taking the chance that they can't get to it in time if a shootout does occur? Does a truly civilized nation arm its teachers? Has it come to that? Conservatives tend to be the ones who espouse the greatness of America. Ask yourself, how great is a nation that has to arm its teachers? So as a conservative, what you can and should do is also ask for sensible regulations concerning firearm ownership and the types of firearms that can be made available, regulations that aren't too restrictive. But both sides have to be reasonable in the debate. This, of course, is easier said than done. I think that any discussion concerning gun control should also include the distribution or sale of weapons. And there are a few things concerning this act I'd like to talk about. First, concerning gun shows. The Gun Control Act of 1968 requires anyone engaged in the business of selling guns to have a federal firearms license and keep a record of their sales. However, this law does not cover all gun sellers. If a person is selling from his or her private collection and the principal objective is not to make a profit, the seller is not engaged in business and therefore is not required to have a license. This is the so-called gun show loophole. I think that if my proposed yearly renewed registration and insuring of every weapon were mandated, this would help in tracking weapons sold through these shows. Some people propose not allowing anybody but licensed dealers at gun shows, and obviously that's another avenue that could be taken here, but I think this is a way that the everyday person could take guns to a gun show and sell them. It's much like just selling your car from your own house. As long as you have a registration, you sign off on that registration, and you have it re-registered under somebody else, then it's still being tracked. But moreover, I think that dealers at gun shows should have to provide detailed inventory upon registering for a show and match inventory to sales upon the show's completion, all of which should be filed with the ATF. And we track and file the registration of every vehicle in this country. I don't think it's too much to ask to do the same with firearms. Now, regarding the dealers themselves, I think the ATF needs to re-examine its practices in issuing and renewing licenses to dealers. A 2010 investigative journalism piece conducted by the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel revealed that 50 stores over 20 states had their licenses revoked by the ATF for various violations over a 6-year period, only to have a relative, friend, or employee pull a fresh license, and then the previous license holder still remained closely connected to that store. Now, it seems that the ATF is able to recognize and act upon violations, which is good, but it does a poor job in vetting possible licensees. I think that the process of issuing a license to a potential dealer needs to be re-examined, and the process of obtaining a license made more rigorous. No doubt there needs to be a discussion about many things concerning this debate. An individual's rights to own a firearm, an individual's right not to be harmed by a firearm, what type of firearm should be allowed, what type of ammunition should be allowed, should firearms be registered yearly and insured, what the licensing process for a dealer should be, or how to handle gun show sales. But any discussion concerning these issues is only going to be productive if all players act with cool heads and are willing to listen to opposing viewpoints. Sandy Hook has made this issue very emotional for many, and rightfully so. But emotions don't tend to serve well in policy debates. Now, I often like to look at issues in relation to positive and negative rights. A negative right is a right not to be subjected to an action of another person or group. Negative rights permit or oblige inaction. A positive right is a right to be subjected to an action or another person or group. Positive rights permit or oblige action. I think that in talking about gun control, both sides can claim a negative right. That is, gun owners believe they have the negative right not to be subjected to restrictions posed by gun control advocates, whereas gun control advocates believe they have the negative right not to be exposed to the lethal threat of firearms. Both groups reject any positive right the opposition might have regarding the issue. That is, they don't believe that they are obliged to allow action from the other group. Gun owners don't believe that they are obliged to allow restrictions or regulations, and gun control advocates don't believe that they should be subjected to the harms of illicit or negligent gun use. Political philosopher Isaiah Berlin clarified the distinction in a famous lecture titled Two Concepts of Liberty. If negative liberty is concerned with the freedom to pursue one's interest according to one's own free will and without interference from external bodies, then positive liberty takes up the degree to which individuals or groups are able to act autonomously in the first place. In other words, what are the conditions under which individuals shape their understandings of their own free will? What gives individuals a positive idea about how they should act, rather than negative limitations on how they may not act? This is usually the main question asked in nearly any issue that arises. How do we balance the negative rights of the individual with the positive rights that ultimately arise from living within a society? In the case of firearm ownership, your negative right could lead to very dire consequences for another individual, infringing on what I think is the principal negative right, the right to take in oxygen. So here I think both sides have an argument to possessing a negative right, but I think that given a person's very existence might be the consequent of the positive right to gun ownership, regulations that lead toward the gun advocate stance might be in order. But again, I think that we have to be careful as to not be too restrictive. Regulations that limit the caliber and round capacity of weapons, as well as how firearms are distributed and registered, are likely just, if you consider the social ramifications of firearms and the potential harm they can cause. But I think we have to understand that unless we ban firearms outright and somehow manage to eliminate every weapon in the country, and this will never happen, of course, so no matter the restrictions imposed, individual citizens will always be subject to harm from firearms. Mitigating that harm is the best we can hope to do. Okay, so the last thing I would like to discuss concerning firearms is where mental health fits into the equation. It seems to be that if you're at a point where you feel the desire to shoot up a school, or a shopping mall, or a mosque, or a theater, that you likely have mental health issues. You know, I think we're all crazy in our own way, but the degree to which that crazy is manifested varies. Some of us just have weird obsessions, or phobias, or isms, to use a general term. But sometimes some of us snap, and innocent members of society feel the brunt of that. We could take guns out of society, and I still think that those that want to lash out will find a way. Maybe they'll just drive their car through a shopping mall, or make a pipe bomb to explode in a school. Crazy will always find a way to manifest itself. The question is, how can we recognize those that are about to snap and try to get them help, or possibly even institutionalized, before they snap and cause great harm to innocent people? You know, I don't have the answers to that, but I do believe that the mental health system in this country is underfunded, and will likely see further cuts as austerity measures are implemented to rein in the deficit. And I think for many people, their decision to seek mental health treatment is dependent on cost, as are most things in life. Well, according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health report from July 7, 2011, from 2005 to 2009, 1/3 of individuals who received outpatient mental health services in the past year indicated that most of the cost for those services was paid by private health insurance. 43% of those who received inpatient mental health services indicated that most of the costs were paid for by public insurance such as Medicaid and Medicare. Point 2 is self or family member was the main source of payment for 26.2% of adults receiving outpatient mental health services and 18.8% of those receiving inpatient mental health services. Point 3, among adults who indicated that all or part of their outpatient mental health services was paid for by self or family member, 2.3% had out-of-pocket costs that exceeded $5,000. 9.6% of those who indicated that all or part of their inpatient mental health treatment was paid for by self or family member had out-of-pocket costs that exceeded $10,000. So basically, only a little over 1/3 of those receiving mental health services had most of their costs covered. The rest had to rely on other sources such as their own savings or help from a family member, with out-of-pocket expenses ranging from $5,000 to $10,000. The Affordable Care Act will require healthcare plans on state exchanges to cover mental health services. However, states have discretion in defining what those services are and how much funding they get. Moreover, this doesn't address how we identify and treat mental health disorders. Now, to be sure, a very small percentage of people in need of mental health services act out violently. I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to add to the stigma of having a mental disorder, or suggest that all people who need mental health treatment are on the brink of committing a violent act. However, some of the response to Sandy Hook has been to add more guns to the equation. I say, let's try to rewrite the equation. Let's try to defuse the bomb before it goes off. Will making mental health treatment more accessible financially to roughly 2/3 of the nation that currently don't have covered access mean that we'll never see another Sandy Hook? I would say no. However, I think we stand a chance to eliminate some future instances, as well as provide much-needed mental health services for all of our citizens, which would be a net gain for all of society. Like I said, we're all crazy in our own way. Most of our craziness is fairly innocuous, if not whimsical or comical. However, sometimes people snap, and the reverberations from that snap too often leads to the death of dozens of innocent people, and in the case of Sandy Hook, dozens of children. I have to believe that with proper funding and professionals trained with the ability to recognize those that are at risk of being the next Adam Lanza, we can prevent a tragedy such as Sandy Hook, no matter the weapons that are or aren't available.
Oh, my mind, it is racing, my face is chasing these emotions. I seek to show you some sweet pursuit is at the root and core of all being. The pities we render, the skyline so cleverly chiseled by God and forced into our eyes. The mystery hollow, the call back tomorrow, the act and the staging, our tragedies refined.
Well, that's going to conclude this episode of Left, Right, in the Middle. If you noticed, I didn't talk about statistics related to gun violence, because I think that they are irrelevant to the discussion. I'm not saying that any deaths due to firearm use are irrelevant, just that the use of statistics as an argument for banning firearms is irrelevant. Is 5,000 deaths better than 11,000 deaths annually? Well, sure. But the point is, people are still dying from firearm use. As I stated, unless we eliminate firearms completely, and this doesn't mean just ban them, we would have to eliminate even their illegal existence. So unless we can do that, every individual is subject to possibly being subjected to harm from a firearm. I think that this discussion ultimately comes down to negative and positive rights and how the Second Amendment is interpreted. The Supreme Court has ruled that the Second Amendment upholds the individual's right to possess a firearm, but the positive right imposed by said possession presents lethal consequences to others. This is a point that many people find hard to reconcile. So what needs to be decided is what type and caliber weapons an individual has the right to own, so that we can mitigate any possible harm caused by the use of firearms, while still trying to uphold the basic right to possession that is provided in the Second Amendment. This could only be accomplished through open and civil discourse, and by the opposing sides truly considering opposing viewpoints. Unfortunately, in a free and open society, there are positive rights imposed upon us that we don't agree with. Some people don't like paying taxes that go to social services. Some people don't like paying taxes that go towards building war products. And of course, some people don't like being subjected to possible harm from a weapon that they would never choose to own or use. As I said, that's the nature of the beast being America. Our founders created a constitutional framework from which we continue to reinterpret and work within. But the basic principle of providing as much freedom to individuals as possible, while still allowing for maximum safety and prosperity for society as a whole, has always been a common thread throughout history. I have no doubt that concerning gun control, we are about to see history made within the coming weeks. I just hope that we don't jerk our knees so hard that we feel the pain from it for years to come. Let's think rationally about how we can still provide the negative freedom of gun ownership to the responsible individual, while putting into place restrictions and regulations that can best mitigate any possible mass violence, or any violent act for that matter. So I hope you'll download the next episode in 2 weeks, in which I discuss an issue that should have been a leading topic during the campaigns, but was not mentioned even once in the debates leading up to the election, that being climate change. Until then, I hope that you and yours have a very Merry Christmas and a safe and Happy New Year. And if you are driving during any of the festivities over the coming weeks, please don't drink. As always, you can go to the website for links to the sources on today's topic, as well as find information on the music that I play in the breaks. Also, you can link to the Facebook page directly from the website, so please do so. I welcome your comments concerning not only the topics I discuss on this show, but any political topic. So look for the show in 2 weeks on climate change, and until then, thanks for listening.
I was broken, and you came. And the world was right again. I was falling, and you lifted me with the kissing that you gifted me. I was wrong, you made me right with your warmth all through the night. I was bad, you made me good in the moments when you could. I was drowned,